Okay. Right. We should be ready to go literally in the next probably 3 minutes or so. So I'm welcoming everybody who's here today because this is going to be an absolutely great event that we're going to be going through today. And I'm going to be sharing my experience with pharmacists, nurses, doctors, and essentially how to master or start to get a better understanding of how to approach anatomy. That's basically the plan, and that's what we're going to be going through. So literally give me a couple of moments, I'll be back, and we are intending to start exactly on time, which is 3 minutes to go. So I'll be back literally in 2 minutes time, and we're going to go through everything that I've learned in the past probably 3 to 4 weeks on how to actually really start to study anatomy, how to make sure that I don't make or don't waste time. So I'm going to go through that all with you, from textbooks to recommend, all the way to websites to possibly interact with, what to do, what not to do, what mistakes I've made, because I've watched thousands of videos on YouTube and they're all great. They're all good what they say, but there's certain elements that I felt that were missing. So I'm going to share that experience with you. And then we're going to build on this over the course of the week, where we're going to start to talk about actual anatomy itself, starting with the upper limb, then going on to moving on to the thorax and the back and so on. It's going to be absolutely amazing. So give me 2 minutes. I'm going to be right back, and we're going to go through this step by step. I'll be back in a moment, folks. Right, welcome everyone to this YouTube video today that we're going to be discussing on the anatomy and how you can essentially get the best out of your learning, and how you don't need to make the mistakes that I made in terms of getting your head around how to approach anatomy, how to study anatomy. And over the last 6 to 8 weeks, I have spent researching, from listening to other colleagues all the way to buying and investing in so many books. And that's just literally not even a couple of percent of the books that I bought on anatomy because I just wasn't too sure how to approach it. So I'm going to go through it with you step by step on how to do this. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Fahim. I'm a pharmacist prescriber, contractor, and the founder of MedLearn. And essentially our vision is to upskill clinicians so you can be the best versions of yourself and essentially love what you do and make a difference and help build a better world. That's essentially what we're doing here. So that is essentially why I do what I do, as you can see on the slide itself. But the musculoskeletal system, and honestly, I have started, I think about 8 to 12 weeks ago on the musculoskeletal system. And literally at one point, I was prepared to throw in the towel. And if it wasn't for some lovely colleagues of mine, namely Imad Adul, Liliane and Zahira, and 2 or 3 other colleagues of mine who have been very, very supportive, I was throwing in absolutely the towel with anatomy because I never expected it to be so tough and so boring. Like literally, you know, this is a course that's very descriptive and you have to essentially memorize a lot of stuff. So I thought, so I've never been like this in my time, but I've actually thought about throwing in the towel, and I don't give up easy, but this was one of those times. So I had to share it with you on how you don't make the mistakes that I made. So this is the musculoskeletal system, and you can imagine that there's absolutely a lot to remember. And when I speak with colleagues, and I've spoken with colleagues, some will say you just have to memorize. You just have to know it. And some of these textbooks, if you have a look here, are thousands and thousands of pages. How can you possibly memorize everything? So I started to research, looked on YouTube, looked at what other people had to say, and there were some great pointers that they gave, but I felt there was something actually missing on how to approach the topic itself. And I'm going to break it down for you what I feel you need to be doing to get the best out of this. Number one, folks, is textbooks. So irrespective of whatever course you go to, whether you're studying medicine, whether you're studying advanced clinical practice in pharmacy, or you're doing nursing, absolutely you're going to have access to textbooks. And let's straighten this out. You're going to have access to textbooks. And there's going to be thousands of textbooks on anatomy that are absolutely huge, like a library on textbooks on anatomy. And where do you start? You've got clinically oriented anatomy by Moore. You've got their review version. You've got Gray's. You've got BD Cerratus. That's only just a couple. There's many more. There's by Netter. There's by Lippincott. It doesn't stop. And I think when you're looking to learn from a textbook, irrespective of whatever textbook you choose, the first thing you need to do is you need to understand before you read any textbooks, what is it you're trying to learn? Is it facts or is it concepts? Because when I picked up a book on anatomy, I never actually realized that there may be, and this is not 100%, you don't have to agree with everything I say, but I never realized that there might be actually a way to approach reading a textbook. Traditionally, I picked up a textbook and I just started to read. I never thought about actually trying to differentiate between what is it that I'm trying to learn from this textbook. Is it facts? Is it concepts? I never also understood this concept of actually scanning the textbook or scanning the chapter before you go ahead and start to put yourself in there. So I think the first message I'd like to give you, it doesn't really matter what textbook you pick, because all of them share a very similar information. Yes, some textbooks are easier to read. Some textbook might be more pictorial, more pictures, but seriously, folks, with anatomy, I can't pick a textbook that I would recommend that you should go to read. Instead, what I'd recommend is to stick with the textbook that's recommended by university. But my advice to you is get hold of the review version. So all of these books, like Clinical Anatomy by Moore, this is the main textbook. So you've got the main textbook. And then you have access to the review books. And the review book, for example, like this, it'll be something like Essential. Let me actually get the tool down. It'll be something like Essential Review, or it will be a review version. And this is literally what you need to know on a need to know basis. So my first advice to you is, if you do have the major textbook, have the major textbook, but also get the review version of the textbook. And there's review versions for Gray's, There's review versions for clinically oriented anatomy. And essentially what the review version does is it condenses all the information to what you need to know. Without the kerfuffle, without the riffraff, without the extra information, I think that's an absolute really, really important tip for you all to know. And that goes for whether it's physiology, histology, pathology, clinical examination skills, whatever it might be. You have the textbook, but also have the review book, because the review book is absolutely everything on a need to know basis. It's more condensed in what you need to know. Put it this way, the Clinical Anatomy by Morse, the main book is around 2,500 pages, something like this, about 2,500, I think something like 2,900, something like that pages. It might be slightly more. The Essential is around 1,000 pages. So you can imagine how they've condensed everything on a need to know basis in those chapters. That's the first tip I'd like to give you. Tip number 2, as you start to learn, especially with anatomy, make sure you understand knowing facts and knowing concepts. What is it that you're trying to learn? Are you memorizing certain parts of the bone, names, or are you trying to understand a particular concept? It might be how the body functions or how the muscle functions, or rather how the muscle fibers are orientated, and that might help you with the function. So you need to establish, am I learning facts? Am I learning concepts? Because your approach has to be different. Concepts stay with you for life. Facts come and go. Facts are good for exams. Facts are good to make you look smarter. Beautiful. But concepts will remain for life. So make sure you understand, when is it a concept, when is it a fact? And let me give an example, right? So let's say we're talking about the anatomy and you're thinking about maybe it's a particular bone, like the collarbone, and you just have to know that it's the clavicle. Now, that's a particular fact that you might need to remember, and we're going to talk about how to approach facts, but that's fine. But then you might think about, actually, why do we have the collarbone? What's the function of the collarbone? And the concept of the collarbone essentially is it's providing a support where we can attach our limbs, like the arms. We can also attach parts of the skeleton that acts as the axes, and we're going to go into this in a moment. So for example, let me explain to you what the axes, right? Here's your major skeleton here. This is the skeleton, and everything else will attach to it. So for example, there's the arms here, there's your limbs here, okay? And everything will attach to this central core, the axes, the core, where everything will actually branch off of. And if you think about the clavicle actually provides that support and provides that attachment, as you can see. The collarbone, that's what it does. And if you have a look at my friend here, and we will be using a lot of him when we go into the teaching section, so you can see that the clavicle itself is providing that support. That's where that becomes important, because although you can remember it's the collarbone, but the concept, you need to understand that it provides a support. Another thing I'd like to mention to you is when you damage, for example, if you were to fall on your hand, what we find is all this energy or this pressure, this tension actually starts to work its way upwards and goes all the way to the collarbone, and the collarbone can actually fracture or can break that way. It's very, very common for you to fall on the outstretched hand and for all the energy to be transported all the way up to the collarbone, and you can fracture the collarbone. Now, this is a concept you need to understand. You can't memorize that. You've learned the collarbone, but how do you memorize this concept of this energy being transferred all the way up from what we call the appendicular skeleton, or the skeleton that's attached to the core, the outside. So let me clarify this here. Imagine this is the body, right? This is the body here. This is the central part of the body. And here we have other parts that attach. So this might be the arms, this might be the legs. We call this the appendicular skeleton. So you can see it attaches to this. It's not the axis, it's not the core. So we call it the appendicular, the appendages, meaning that part of a structure, that part of a body that is not directly attached to the main central part, okay? Think of it like a car, right? The car, you've got the car, then you've got the wheels, you've got the doors. They're the appendicular, they're the extra parts that are attached to the car itself. So with the collarbone itself, I'm just trying to explain to you about facts and concepts. The collarbone is a fact, you've got to remember the name. The concept is what it does. It provides a rigid support. It provides, like in some In some areas, you see it provides like a strut. So we won't go into that too much, but essentially it provides a rigid support. It also transmits all the energy or all the shock that makes its way as you stretch your hands. It goes to the collarbone, so you can break the collarbone. So it's quite important for you to remember that when you're studying is the facts and concepts. And I like to say, when you're studying facts, use certain mnemonics and certain tools to help you with facts. That's what I'd say. So for example, let me give you an example of this. So let me write this down. So if I wanted to remember some of the muscles that attach to this clavicle, there are too many. Okay, I'm just going to write this mnemonic down. So I'm just going to write some of this down for you. And we have, so this is just something that I want to write down. So, you have the Durham public schools, and they have teachers, and they have students, and they have staff. And you can then use certain mnemonics, and you can make your own mnemonics to remember with the clavicle. Okay, so we're going to have possibly the pectoralis major muscle actually attaching here. We're going to have the trapezius muscle attaching. We're going to have the deltoid muscle attaching. That's where you can use certain mnemonics to help you. So for facts, I would use mnemonics. Really easy. So you can have many different mnemonics. And I would make up your own mnemonics if I were you, because you could remember them. And the more weird they are, and the more wonderful they are, and the more, folks, I guess, the more sexually orientated they are. I don't know why, but it seems to stick in the mind itself. So I don't know what it is, but you could remember certain muscles as I love spinach and I love sex. And for some reason, I don't know why, but when you talk about these sexually orientated ones, they tend to remember more. And that might just be weird, but I just find that sort of stuff just sticks. So when you're remembering facts, remember mnemonics. Makes it easy for you. So if it's a particular muscle attachment, or it's particular fibers, or particular ligaments, facts. If it's concepts, understand the concepts. So when you're reading a textbook, what I would recommend, for example, if I was going to read, let's say this textbook here, and let's say I was going to pick up this textbook and I was going to read this textbook. So this is an atlas. Before I go on to read the textbook itself, I would look at the chapters, and I would review the chapters. Like, what is it I'm trying to learn from this chapter? So in the first chapter of this book, it's actually talking about, the first part is essentially talking about the introduction. So apparently it's something about the back. So that's the first part. It's talking about the back. Second chapter is talking about the upper limb. Third chapter is lower limb, the thorax. Then when I get into the back itself, I'm like, what is it I want to learn about the back? I want to learn about the muscles. I'm just going to scan it about, apparently there's something about planes. You can see that there's talking about planes. So before I read any of that, I'm going to ask myself, okay, so it's telling me about planes. I'll probably have to know what are planes. There's different colors. The next part talks about a skeleton that's there. And I'm going to question myself, what is it I'm trying to learn from this page? There's certain skeleton, there's certain picture, there's certain bones. That's fine. The next page again shows a skeleton, obviously because an atlas probably wasn't the best book to go by. It's just got something that's called a nucleus pulposus. So before I even start to read, I'm gauging, I'm priming my brain to think. And the reason is because when you open up something and you're trying to find something, you're likely to find the answers. For example, if I read a textbook on anatomy and I read a sentence or a heading that talks about the scapula, and I question myself, okay, so I want to know, what does the term scapula mean? What is its function? Where are its attachment? What are the ligaments? I guarantee when you start to read that text, everything will pop up in front of you. Oh, wow, that's the answer to that. That's the answer to that. But when you start to read things without having some sort of structure, that's where things go wrong. So that's the first points I want to mention to you is get the textbook, get a review version. Before you approach, scan the topics. Are you looking for facts, or are you looking to learn concepts? For facts, really straightforward, learn mnemonics. It'll just make your life a lot easier. You can just memorize it that way, make your own mnemonics up. And the internet has so many mnemonics that you can use. Concepts, try to understand. Right, an atlas. Another advice that was given to me is buy an atlas from doctors and colleagues. And okay, I think that there's many atlases. I think I found Lippincott to be one of the best because I found their drawings quite good. Netters is quite good as well. But in terms of atlases, I think they're only as useful if you can really picture what's going on. And I honestly think there's nothing better than doing human dissection or getting hold of a skeleton. Seriously, that's what I found. Because a lot of everything that you're learning about anatomy, the text is trying to describe the structure. Think about what is anatomy. It's just a group of people that got together and started to describe structure. Function we can understand because you can, oh, we don't want to drop everything here. That's the problem with having too many books. There we go. So the problem that you have with a lot of these atlases is that anatomy is always trying to describe. It's a descriptive science. For example, let's look at this computer screen here. So if you're looking at this screen, you might say, right, looking at this screen, there's a border that is a superior border. There's a border that you might say that's more towards away from the center of the computer screen. That's a lateral border. And there's a border that's an inferior border, there's a medial border. If you're reading that, literally close your eyes and I'm describing to you, close your eyes and I say, look, there's a screen, there's a superior border, lateral border, inferior border, medial border, and then there is an attachment that comes off the medial border. At some point, you're going to get lost. It's difficult. It's difficult without seeing it. That's where I struggled. I was reading the textbook. I was trying to picture it. I couldn't picture it because I hadn't seen it before. Then I got the atlas and I tried to picture off the atlas, but the atlas is not a three-dimensional. It's not 3D. It's a 2D picture. So you're reading it and it was getting stressful. That's when I started to just go and invest a couple of £100 and buy a skeleton. Just makes it so much easier because when you're reading the text and you've got the actual skeleton in front and you've got the atlas that's pointing out, everything becomes so easier. In actual fact, I've covered more in one day than I did in 6 weeks because it's easy. I've read a bit about the clavicle today and most of it I can remember, from the joints to the ligaments to the attachments. Why? Because I can picture the clavicle in front of me. So that's what I'd advise you. As much as these atlases are great to have, perfect, the first advice that I got was buy an atlas. I didn't find it that useful. I couldn't apply it. Second advice I got was it's a descriptive science. We all know that. That didn't help much. So I'd recommend if you do get an atlas, I find Lippincott quite useful, but do buy the skeleton if you can. Also, when you are going to approach, how to approach it, know your facts when you're reading a fact and when you're reading a concept. When it's facts, learn mnemonics. Simple, learn mnemonics. Mnemonics that work for you. You can remember all the muscles in the world. It's not rocket science. So that's what's going to be important. Buying a skeleton, folks, I paid around £200. So if you're interested in buying a skeleton, this is the one that I bought. So I thought I'd put it on there. I find it to be absolutely quite useful for my learning because I like to touch, like to feel. I couldn't just do it off a skeleton. And I don't want to learn anatomy just for my exams. I want to learn it for life. I don't want to be one of those clinicians who says, oh, I hate anatomy. Anatomy is boring. It's useless. It's not useful. It's only useful if you're doing surgery. It doesn't have to be that way. If you learn it properly and you understand concepts and facts, it can be easy because you might forget the facts. But if you've written your mnemonic, you can remember them again. So that's what I'd recommend. That's what I bought it for. And I absolutely think it's a real deal because you can actually start to play with it. And I find it quite useful. So that's another tip that I'd recommend. Then, folks, you need to teach. It doesn't mean that you have to teach like I'm teaching here and over the course of the webinar series. It doesn't mean that we have to teach it like this. You could teach it to friends, family. If you don't have any friends or family, then why don't you come along to this YouTube and you can even, I'm happy to do webinars with you and we can teach it together, or teach your friends, because teaching reinforces. Honestly, if you can teach and you don't need to know everything, you're doing it for your learning. This webinar series that I'm doing, I'm not necessarily doing it as officially part of Medline. It's for my teaching experience, for me to teach and for me to carry it out to you. And I know some of you are there on YouTube, some of you are there on Zoom, some of you are there on LinkedIn Live, but I'm actually teaching to the camera. I don't really know who's sat opposite, but I'm so used to teaching in front of a screen, it works for me. So however you do it, teaching absolutely will be useful because it will force you to prepare. And I think before my exams, I'm certainly going to find this useful and it gives you a structure. So I'd recommend teaching as well. I think it's one of the best ways to do it because you're going to come up with ways to make you remember stuff. So then, honestly, I can't tell you, probably the most important thing is learn the language. If you're looking to do anatomy, I cannot highlight this enough. You need to learn the language. And this is something that nobody told me. This is something that nobody told me, that you need to learn the language. And I think this is the most important point. Learn the language. Learn the language. Because when you learn the language, it becomes so much easier. When you look at all those muscles, they're not complicated anymore. When I was reading about the forearm, and I had all these muscles, digitarum, flexor, you had something, digitarum carpi, you had the coracoid process, you had the coracoid ligament, you had the acromioclavicular joint. How are you possibly going to memorize this without knowing the language? It's impossible. And if it's possible, it's going to be short term. Give it a couple of weeks, you'll forget everything like this. So let me give an example. So this term here, the anchitubulum, not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, essentially means, and it's Latin for cup holder or the small vinegar cup. And when you look at the small vinegar cup, absolutely, it looks very similar to what we're actually looking at here. It looks similar. And I will never forget that now, because I went out there, I did the research, and I said, what does that term actually mean? And remember that when anatomy was being started, and you look at Leonardo da Vinci, you look at the Greek, the French, all they were doing was looking at terms and describing terms. That's all they were doing. For example, this here, the coracoid process, if you actually look at the actual definition and where it was derived from, it means beak-like. And it's true, because the coracoid process actually looks like this. And that pretty much looks like a beak to me. That's what it is. There you go. We can, if I can try to rotate it around, I'm not going to be able to rotate it, but you can see it's kind of like a beak. So if we were to draw this around, and imagine this was the actual, my drawing's bad, but that's good enough, right? Look, there's the eyes, ta-da, and there's the beak. It's beak-like. And when you actually start to look at this and describe it here, it is beak-like. Here, look, it's actually beak-like. And let's pick this little puppy up and let me show you. And if I show you here, I'm never going to forget this now. Whenever I see that term, I'm going to try to zoom in for you folks. And if you can see this here, right here, you can see it shaped like a beak. Look, it comes off here. It's like a beak. And it's beak-like. When you look at the acromion, and we talk about the acromion, essentially that means it's the highest point. And we look at the scapula, and we look at the shoulder blade itself, it connects from the back, like this. This is the spine of the scapula. And it connects all the way to the acromion. And why they call it the acromion? Because it was the summit, it was the peak. It was the highest point for this part of the shoulder blade. It makes sense. Call that the acromion, call that the coracoid process, beak-like. Why not? You see, everything starts to make sense with anatomy when you put a bit of effort in. So I think the most important thing that you can do, and I'm going to go through it with you in the webinar series itself, I'm going to define all the most important structures that I feel that you need to know. And I'm going to go through that definition with you step by step, because I've spent hours doing this. It's taken me probably 8-9 hours to research. I couldn't find an exact book. I have a feeling this skeleton's going to fall, but I hope he doesn't fall. The point is that I've spent hours doing this research, so I'll go through it with you in all the definitions that I have. You might not get the same experience that I had because I was actively searching for information, so it's staying in my head. But now, when I look at, for example, the acromioclavicular joint, makes sense to me. Fair enough. That kind of joint there, okay, it's to do with the acromion, the clavicle. Fair enough. It makes sense. That's what it's pointing out to. If I have a particular muscle, for example, I'm just making this up, but let's say it's the flexor pollices or the metatarsals. Let's talk about the metatarsals. Tarsal essentially refers to, or let's say the metacarpals. So we've got the carpi, which are basically the wrist bones. Meta means this is happening afterwards. So that's why they call them metacarpals. Makes sense. Phalanxes or phalanxes, the phalanx, you can think of are essentially the word itself comes from log-like or very straight and narrow, and the fingers are like logs. That's true. So if I see a muscle that's attaching to the phalanxes, I know what that means. If I've got a muscle that's attaching to the metacarpals, there's the carpi. Carpi means wrist, and it's after. Meta means after. That's the point. When you start to learn it like this, the anatomy makes sense. Let's look at the trapezius muscle. Shaped like a, shape, it's a particular shape. Let's look at the rhomboid muscle. It's shaped like a rhomboid. Let's look at the Cerratus anterior and so far. We're going to get into this. There's so many different words and terms, but this is the point I think that's the most important, is that you need to learn the language. And I'm going to go through it with you because I've done it anyway. So for the most important terms, we're going to go through because it will just help you. And it will make sure that when you read a particular muscle, I'm not fazed by the muscle anymore. Levator scapulae makes sense. Levator means to make it, we're going to levitate this or elevate it and so on. Scapula refers to the shoulder blades. What's difficult there? Nothing. So that's important for you to remember as well. Quiz yourselves, definitely. I'm going to be going through exam style questions after we've done our series. So I'm going to be going through questions from books that I have that I'm going to be testing us on to really apply what I've learned, because you can learn all this, but application is important. So going through questions, going through testing yourself is always, always very, very important. So I'd recommend that we do that as well. And I'll be going through questions with you to help you with that anyway. So that's quite important as well. So the books that I'd recommend, I think, to be honest, I would recommend certainly get the essential book itself. I think that's great. I would certainly recommend getting that book. If you are going to buy this book, then get the main textbook as a reference. So I would say use this as a reference, If you've got time, use this as a reference, but I'm pretty much studying from this book at the moment because everything is there. Remember, anatomy is very, very descriptive and the functions are going to be in, that's what I'm using. BRS is quite good as well. It's quite summarized. You then have Snell and you have Gray's. You've got BD Cerratus as well. I think this book is really good, which is Instant Anatomy, because it just, it helped me with, see, my books are going to fall. It helped me with it really did help me with it just summarizes everything, and knowing all the muscles are like in tables there for you. So when I was trying to learn the definitions, I just looked at all of these and I just learned all their definitions and wrote them down, what they're actually trying to say. So I find this book quite good because it summarizes all the joints, all the origins. You can really get to where you want to get to fast. I think it'd be quite useful once you qualify as doctors or when you start to use this in practice, because it's really to the point. So I'd say books that I'd recommend, definitely Essential, then get the reference. If you're studying from Gray's, get the review book itself. And this is so good. Clinical Anatomy by Snell. Again, this is like the review version of this book. And I think this is quite good. So again, the review books are going to be important. That's your bread and butter. And you can have a look. There's a review version here. Look at the text. It's a lot thinner. If I bring out this bad boy, and we will bring this bad boy out. Here you go. There you go. Try reading through that. You know how many pages this is? Let's just do it. This book is, hey, actually, it's not 2,900 pages. It's 1,000. It's 1,000 something pages. This book must be half that. So that was incorrect from my point of view. Yeah, so this is less. This is less. The chapters are a lot smaller. So, half the size possibly for what you need. But this is quite thick. And it's very heavy. So you can imagine that as well. So that's there for you. Okay, so moving on. Websites. Okay, so I spent a lot of money on websites as well. I did end up spending a lot of money on websites because I was desperate. I don't know why I was thinking that possibly by signing up to these websites, possibly I was thinking that signing up to these websites, I was thinking that would help me with my learning. I don't necessarily agree with that anymore. I don't think that signing up to these websites actually helps you with your learning per se, because you still have to do the learning. I think KenHub is quite good. Even Instant Anatomy is quite good. Using tools like Anki are quite good. Lecture, they're all good, but they can't take away the learning that you have to put in. They can't take away the learning that you have to put in. That's the problem. So as much as these websites are great, they don't take away the learning that you have to put in to do them. So I think KenHub is really good in terms of what they're doing. However, you still have to learn it. So they'll summarize, let's say, muscle attachments and everything, and they'll summarize the action of the muscles more easy for you, so you don't have to read the text. You still have to learn it. So I think there are other resources that don't have to be paid for. For example, Anatomy Zone is not paid for, Anatomy Zone is great. You don't have to pay for it. I think that's a free version, which is great. Hats off to him. Instant Anatomy is very good as well to help you. Anki, I'm not sure how familiar you are with Anki, but Anki is a tool that you can use for making flashcards. I think it's a very useful tool, but there is a bit of a steep learning curve. If you're not tech savvy, you might struggle with using it initially. So it's a bit of a learning curve. Again, Lecturio is quite good, but none of them actually distributes or will actually remove the learning that you have to put in. If you want a 3D version where you can actually play about with it, nothing beats Primal Pictures. So I've used Primal Pictures as well, which is pretty good as well. I've used that as well. I find that quite useful, but it can be quite expensive. So if you're asking me which ones should you buy and which ones should you invest in, I don't think per se that you need to buy anything. I would say that actually my advice to you is don't buy anything. Anatomy Zone is quite good. It gives you everything. KenHub is quite good if you want to pay for something, but I don't think you need to pay for it. I've got the license for it as well. I don't think it's something that you have to pay for. But if you were going to pay for it, fair enough. But Anatomy Zone does pretty much everything, and it's free, and it's very, very good. So that's the websites that I would recommend. They're all very, very good. But again, none of them actually, I think KenHub does do a good job in trying to explain to you about knowing the importance of definitions, but I don't think it stresses it enough. And doesn't go into that much depth about knowing the terminology. If you knew your terminology, anatomy is pretty straightforward. So how do you approach? So as I mentioned to you about how to approach it itself, I would recommend learn the concepts and know when you're learning facts. For example, names of bones, possibly the bones and where their attachments are, or the muscle that attach there, they're facts, and you can learn them essentially through mnemonics. Use mnemonics, they're so good to help you remember. I would recommend that you do purchase a model. I found that extremely useful for me because the books are describing something and the skeleton will just put it into practice for you. It's super, super, super important to do that. I'd recommend. Now, someone's asked a question. Salman has asked a question. Is it compulsory to buy books? You mentioned, or we can study hours at university. Any book is fine to study. They're all the same. But I would recommend, I mean, Salman, if you're still there, what book do you have that the university recommend? And I can tell you which one to buy. Also, there are many sites now that essentially allow you, I'm not promoting this, and I'm not saying you do this, but there are sites that allow you to actually get hold of, I don't know if this is true. So I never said this, but there are websites that essentially allow you to download books from third-party sources. So I don't know whether that's, you never heard it from me, but there are websites that actually do that. You can download books. So, but you never heard that from me. But nonetheless, I buy all my books. I always buy my books, as you can see. Everything is bought unless it's given by university. So I would recommend that go by the university and see what books they recommend. But I would recommend for anatomy that you definitely should get hold of something physical, like the actual skeleton. And it's not a lot, where it's £100, £200. You know, it works out to, depending on where you live, maybe stop one McDonald's meal in the month, and you can get that. And Amazon is actually offering you to not pay regular anyway, so they're giving you payment terms. So I'd recommend that. Know when to learn facts, and I'll go through the mnemonics that I have and try to teach, but stick to what works for you. If you've got a method that works, don't change it. Stick to it. Please don't change it. Don't do that. Don't try to go through this way. Stick to what works for you. If you have a method that works, I'd stick to it. So that's what I'd like to say about this. So moving forward and onwards. Okay, so how do you approach musculoskeletal? So I would recommend, and this is my mnemonic. This is my mnemonic that I use. I use men don't find anatomy tasty as my mnemonic that I use when I'm approaching musculoskeletal. So whenever I'm approaching any part of the body itself, when I think about the actual area, I think about what muscles attach to that area. I need to know the muscles that attach to that area. Like it might be a bone, let's say it's the clavicle. I have to know the muscles that attach there. When I think about the D, or men don't, I think about D for don't. I normally think about description. Can I describe the bone itself that I'm looking at? Can I describe the bone? Can I describe the muscle that I'm trying to learn about? How are the fibers running? What is the book trying to describe to me? Can I describe it? When I'm thinking about the actual F, which is men don't find, I think about function. What is the function of this particular muscle? What is the function of this particular bone? Why I say that is because when you start to do clinical cases, they're going to test your understanding on function. And why a lot of people struggle with anatomy is because they don't relate it to clinical aspects. So function would allow you to relate it to clinical aspects. That's what I would recommend that you do. So that's how I approach it all the time. When I start teaching this as the time goes on, and I start to teach you anatomy, this is the mnemonic that I'm going to use. Can I describe to my colleagues, my students, the muscles that attach there, the description, the function of that area, and then I go on to articulation. What about the joints? Where is it articulating? Where are the joints that are articulating there? Because for the exam or for application, you need to know the joints. Can I remember? So let's see how well I know this. The sternoclavicular joint. What kind of joint is the sternoclavicular joint? What about the acromioclavicular joint? What kind of joint is that? Is it a synovial joint? Is it a plain joint? Is it a fibrous cartilage joint? Is it possibly a suture? What kind of joint is it? Is it can I remember that? Is it a cartilaginous joint? Again, I'm always questioning myself as I'm teaching this. And then the type of bone, if I'm thinking about a particular bone, what type of bone is it? Is it a long bone? Is it a long bone? Is it a short bone? Is it a sesame bone, or is it a short bone? Is it a regular bone? So I'm always testing myself, always questioning myself before I go into this. So that's how I approach this all the time. And I'm always thinking, for example, the pectoralis muscle, the pecs. Why is it known as a convergent muscle? Because if you have a look, first of all, it's fan shaped like this. And what we find is it starts narrow. And then what we notice, it starts to branch out. And that's why it's converging. As you can see, it's starting very, very broad, and then it converges and becomes more narrow. That's how the muscle fibers work. And there is actually a biomechanics behind that. So that's important for you to remember, that there are biomechanics behind it as well, which I'll go through when we start to discuss this. So again, that's how I always approach musculoskeletal. It's the best way to learn it because you're always applying it yourself. Now, I'm going to end the first class here because I don't intend these sessions to be too long because I need to prepare for an exam as well. But in the next class, I'm going to go through the bone classes, how you can remember the different bone classes. After that, I intend to go to the definitions and go through all the definitions that you have to know. And you can see that I've spent a bit of time gathering this for you. And we're going to go through all the definitions. So when you come across, for example, flexor hallucis brevis, you are not going to panic. You know that hallucis has to do with the big toe, flexor, and it's brevis. You'll understand what this means. It's short, it's long, whatever. Interossi, it will make sense to you. Latae or lats will make sense. Indices will make sense to you. No more panicking. If you see hyoid, you'll know it's the hyoid term means U-shaped. So you won't panic anymore. And this is essentially what I want to go through with you folks, step by step, right from start. And you're going to love this because when you come across these, look some of these like abductor pollicis. What does that mean? If you know that the term pollicis refers to the term thumb, that means it's abducting the thumb. What's so difficult there? Proximal interphalangeal joints. Phalanxes. You should know actually the word phalanx means log-like. So it's these long log-like structures. So it's talking about, either it's talking about your fingers or essentially the long, or the toes itself. If it's inter, it means in between. And it's talking about joints, and it's distal, and we can talk about that later. Metatarsophalangeal joints, nothing difficult there. Meta means after, and you're talking about after the phalanxes, or you're talking about the metatarsal, or before rather. So we can go through this in depth, and it will make things easier for you. You will not panic about this anymore. And that's what makes it easier, because when I was reading half of these terms, and you look at this, for example, the extensor carpi radialis brevis, my God, what does that mean? But when you learn all these definitions that we're going to go through, you are going to love it. For example, this I was making reference to here. Cerratus, because serratus is actually saw-like. And when you look at the muscle is like this. And if you look at the edges of a saw, it's like a saw. That's why they call it serratus. So now when I see the term serratus, I don't panic because I get what it's talking about. It makes sense. That's essentially what we're going to go through. Thank you very much for taking time out to be here today, folks. It's been great to have you here. Those of you who are YouTube, those of you who are on LinkedIn and Zoom, great to have you here. Any of you who are watching this have any questions, please ask me about approaching anatomy. I'm happy to go through it with you. But tomorrow I tend to start to go to the teaching class itself. So put it on the chat. I'm happy to answer it and I can answer your question. Please, and I'll put this on there, do ask questions and ask questions for me. And I can see that Salman Khan has asked a question. I've answered that. And I said it's not compulsory to actually buy. So you don't have to buy. So you don't have to buy the textbook. You don't have to buy the text. Essentially, what you need to do is to get a text that works for you. And I would recommend that get the review version. It just makes it easier for you and you can't go wrong. So for those of you here, thank you very much for watching. And I wish you the best of luck with your studies. Join me same time tomorrow and we're going to start to work through this anatomy and we're going to absolutely love it. And you're not going to hate anatomy. And we're not going to say it's a boring, dry subject because I'm going to teach you how I learned it. It's going to be great. So thank you very much.